So you guys remember at the beginning of the year I said I was finally going to finish this notebook and then I didn't? Dun da da da! It's totally complete now! This journal has lasted 4 years and it's done! And I'm gonna start this one! Yay! And writers, for today's video I really wanted to go ahead and talk about how you get started with poetry, both reading and writing. First of all, I'm going to recommend that you watch my recommendations video. I'm going to link that above and down below. I go through a few poets as well as a few poems that I highly recommend that I think are a really good starting ground for you. If you're interested in poetry but don't really know what to start reading, I recommend a couple of steps. First of all, think about your age range and what age range you're interested in reading. If you really like young adult novels, you're probably going to be really interested in some contemporary work, especially by younger women. If you're really interested in children's literature, there are some really good rhyming poets. If you really like kind of think pieces, there are also some poets who really go deep into the metaphor and really make you dig for meaning. Just like any other type of media that we consume, there are genres for poetry. And so think about what you generally like, and I would start going for the poetry equivalent. You're more likely to like someone like Rupi Kaur if you're into young adult than you are to like Shel Silverstein, for example, as something to start off with, or Robert Frost, who can be a bit old and stuffy. Next, I would suggest going to a local bookstore or library. While there is a lot of poetry online, it can be a bit stressful kind of going through and trying to figure out what you would like based upon what, let's say, Poetry.org or the Poetry Foundation, based on what they think is popular right now or what you might like. You might not be into any of those. Whereas I feel like going to a library or bookstore and really getting to peruse the shelves, getting to look at books the same way that you do for novels, is a lot more beneficial. That said, Poetry Foundation has a lot of good poetry. That's a really good resource. You can also find a lot of good poetry hosted on YouTube, but I recommend going to the library. You can ask the librarian or bookseller what types of books you might be interested in. Let's say your favorite book series is the Song of Fire and Ice series. You can ask a bookseller or a librarian what type of poet you might be interested based on that, and they'll probably have a recommendation for you. Whereas looking online, you may or may not get a result for that particular inquiry. Another reason that I recommend that you go to a library so you can have a physical copy is I recommend that you pick up roughly 6 books. If you can find 3 contemporary and 3 classic poets that you feel like you might be interested in, pull those books out, sit down at a table and take a look at them. No stress, read through the poems. From each of those collections that you got, open it randomly and read 2 entire poems. You're perfectly welcome to read 2 short poems and skip past the really, really long ones. Perfectly fine, no stress. You're trying to figure out what you like. But read 2 entire poems by each of the poets and take your favorite book home. At home, I recommend reading through a collection exactly the way you would a novel. Cover to cover, beginning to end, read the entire thing. You don't have to dwell on it, you don't have to think hard about it, but I would try and read fluidly with poetry. Whereas a novel, you're really trying to get through for the plot. With a poem, you're allowed to skip back to the top, to reread sections, to sort of flow through the book organically. You're allowed to skip over parts, you're allowed to skip back. Do what feels natural to you, but make sure you read all of the words on the page in some general form. And if a poem makes you stop and think, that's a good sign. You probably really like this poet. If you really like most of the collection you've read, I recommend you figure out what else that poet has written. If it's a newer poet and they don't have a whole lot of writing, ask your local librarian or bookseller what might be similar to that and try checking out more poems in that category. If you hated it, I would ask again and see if there's a recommendation for something totally different. If you read the entire book and there wasn't a single poem that you liked in it, it's not poetry you have the problem with. You didn't like that poet, and that's perfectly fine. If you did like them, tell them that you like them. You can reach out on social media. Pretty much all writers are on social media right now, and if they're not, maybe leave a review of their book so that other people can enjoy that also. If you've tried reading a couple of different poets and really given them a chance, really read through entire collections, and you're just not into it, have you been reading both contemporary and classic poets? There is a big discrepancy between the two. There's a huge difference between someone writing in a very structured form and someone writing in a very non-structured form. I'm also going to recommend you go to the History of Poetry video that I did to kind of give you an idea of how many different styles of poetry there are. So you've started reading poetry, which I recommend as the first step if you want to try writing poetry. My number one first step if you want to try writing poetry is mimic someone. Who is your favorite poet? Why do you like their poetry? Do that. I recommend when you start writing poetry, absolutely mimic somebody. I recommend that you mimic their themes that they use, write in the same rhyme scheme or meter. If there is a strong rhyme scheme, I recommend copying it. I actually recommend copying form poems quite a bit. When I say copying, I mean mimicking. I would recommend you look up some form poems such as a sonnet and try writing in the style of a sonnet. Try writing in the style of a haiku. When you start writing, it's just for you. So you could write the exact same poem and just, you wrote it yourself, but you copied somebody. That's fine as long as it stays in your notebook. You're learning from it. Now try mixing it up a little. Try using that form but putting your own twist on it, putting your own theme into it. You can even try mimicking another poet's voice. If they have a very strong presence, they use certain types of words that aren't words that you would normally choose, try mimicking that. Mimicry might be a compliment, but I think it's definitely a learning tool. I think using what someone else has mastered as a basis for teaching yourself is very, very valuable. Once you've written your own poems, even if they're sort of based on somebody else's, I would recommend reading them aloud. See how it sounds coming out of your own mouth. You can do it alone in your bedroom with the doors locked, when nobody else is home. That's totally fine. You don't have to suddenly jump up on stage and do it at a big reading. And I'd actually recommend not doing it at a big reading if you've been mimicking poems and not just writing from your own voice. I would recommend starting off reading it to yourself. If it comes across very naturally to you, it's very easy to read, then you've really hit on something. That's good. If it's really hard to read, if you're stumbling across it the whole time, then those are the parts that you're going to need to change eventually. However, you're just starting off writing. I recommend you put your notebook away, set that down for 2 weeks to a month. I'd give it a lot of time. Continue writing poems, but don't go back and reread the ones that you've already written. Those ones are done, and you're writing more poems now. But about every 2 weeks, I would go back and reread the poems that you previously wrote. For me, I keep track of them by dating in the columns. I put the date for each poem, and then I keep track of my poetry that way, so I know it's been 2 weeks. Revisit it, reread it aloud, and revise. This is the next big step. This is where you get from just writing notes to yourself, basically, just diary entering in poems, to actually becoming a poet, is when you start revising those poems that you previously wrote. Find out what isn't working for you, what things didn't come across the way you wanted them to, what things are still difficult to read, and how can you fix those things. And while you're doing this, I recommend you continue reading other poets, figuring out what it is you like about them, and continuing to consume poetry. I would continue to revisit and revise your poems until the only real thing you feel like you can change is maybe shifting a comma or changing a comma to a semicolon. If that's the only thing, everything else fits perfectly and you're really proud of it, then maybe you should consider sharing it. Either just on your blog, either just to your best friend. See what somebody else thinks. This is the next step. This is the next step. This is how you find out if you're actually any good or not. But you never need to get to this step. Poetry isn't some stressful thing. You can write it just for you. It's perfectly fine. You also can read poetry just for you. You don't have to try and pull it apart and figure out what it means. Poetry should make you feel something. It should make some part of you feel alive. It should make something feel true. It should make you react in some manner. And if you do react, then poetry is doing its job. And so I highly recommend everyone get out there, try a new poet today, try writing a poem yourself. If you need some inspiration, I would say let's all write something about cherry blossoms. Because as you can see, I have this beautiful new bedspread. It's actually a duvet cover, but it's gorgeous, which is why we're sitting here. Move that book. Try writing about cherry blossoms. And good luck, and I will see you again soon. Bye!